Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I believe the way it worked out was one of Pierre's associates, either managers or one of his people, got in contact with me about this project and said, you know, there were two other orchestras, maybe three other orchestras involved at that time. It wound up being just three total. And it sounded really interesting to me, and it was funny because at the time she contacted me, I had just heard some of Pierre's chamber music works, which I was thinking of programming. I was really impressed. I mean, I'd heard his name around, of course, and heard, I think, the piano trio, and it was fantastic. And so it kind of went from there. I got in touch with our management and said, you know, what do you think about this? And happily, there was an open mind to that kind of thing, and it fit really well into the thematic programming of this year. So yeah, it came off. First I get the music. The good thing about it is that you can't YouTube it, you can't listen to somebody else's recording. And so you have to bring your own ideas and creativity to whatever you see or feel on the page. The bad thing about it is that you can't YouTube it and there's no recordings. You know, the things that we typically do with other major repertory or even minor repertory, everything's out there pretty much. So it's both a challenge and kind of has unique problems to it. Especially, you know, it's a substantial work. It's 26 minutes or something. So you just start with a blank slate, and I try to just go with whatever's on the page, and hope that I wind up with something. And eventually, I think Steve Copes and I got in touch, and he might have even sent me an early draft of it when he was going to play it, premiere it with St. Paul. So it was clear that I'm not sure whether they were in touch, but that, you know, there was some craftsmanship already before I even got the music. It's funny because I don't know Pierre at all. I only know his music, and I purposely haven't read a lot of program notes about his stuff. Some I know about him and his biography. But, you know, I would rather approach it from my end rather than, at least at first, rather than what may have influenced him. I can guess based on his biography and just the inflections in the piece. But, you know, it's funny, for example, to me it doesn't sound like George Crumb at all, you know, who was one of his main composers. But what I really liked about the piece, just before we talking about anything stylistically, was that there's a depth and a craftsmanship and a brain behind the way he's written this concerto. And one of the problems of a commission that I think a lot of musicians experience is that, you know, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. You don't really know what you're going to get until the first performance. Sometimes the second or third performance. And I think what we're really after, both the composer and the artist playing the piece, is two things. You want a piece of music that's artistically meaningful and deep and connects with the audience and the musicians, and that you want to hear more than once past the premiere, you know. You also want a piece that the musicians want to play more than once. And that doesn't always happen for a variety of reasons, but mostly because of the way that a composer might use either the solo instrument or the orchestra. And what I really love about this piece is his incorporation of both. And you could tell, I think, when both listening and playing it, that this is a person who has substantial experience writing for orchestra and strings. along with some pretty brilliant orchestrations, I think, and effects. And his palette of sounds and tonalities is really interesting. It's very satisfying to work on that and to play it, because it doesn't always happen. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not easy. You know, that's another thing that happens sometimes with commissions or certain composers. I found it both with younger composers and with more established composers. One of two things happens. Either the younger composers are sort of trying to prove a point, as well as perhaps being not as educated as they need to be about how to write for certain instruments. So they write things that are ferociously difficult or impossible to play, where they clearly don't know enough about what they're writing for. So then you get in the rehearsals and everything's being changed around because, well, you can't play that note on a viola or whatever. And they just don't know that. So that's frustrating. Or occasionally you get a well-established composer who's just decided to go in a completely different direction mid to late career. And they write something that is so kind of the opposite, maybe ridiculously simple, or just sort of bland, or just experimenting. And that can have a little blowback also. I think this is a really nice balance, again, of being technically certainly very challenging for the soloist, but he's also incorporated the orchestra in a way that it's really part of the fabric of the piece. They're not sitting there playing whole notes while I'm playing scales up and down. It's not the kind of piece where, as an orchestral musician, I think really throughout the orchestra, I don't think this is the kind of piece at all where you could just show up and read the part at the first rehearsal. Hint, hint. I don't have much of a sense of it. I can tell from hearing the first performance, I'm assuming that he was happy with that, so I would know something about maybe what his preferences were. On the other hand, it was interesting because in many ways, that's not how I would approach the piece at all. So I'm curious to see what his reaction would be with that. I don't think he'll hate it, but he might have suggestions and I might have suggestions. And ideally, you have a collaboration where there's a little bit of an open mind on both sides. That's also not always the case. I've worked with some composers who are just absolutely rigid, and this is what I wrote, and this is why I wrote it, and you should play it like this. So you try to do that. And other people, it's funny, other composers who are shockingly disinterested in how you approach their music. They're sort of, oh, I never thought of that. That's great, Yeah, why don't you cut out those 10 bars? Not really, but that's nice if there's 10 bars that are really difficult that you can just cut out. I don't think Pierre is going to want to do that. So yeah, it can be any one of those, or usually a mix. But it is always really great to have the composer around, because I can't call up Vivaldi if there's a question. Sometimes it's just easy, there are pros and cons to playing as a soloist with my own orchestra, because, again, the great thing is that everybody knows you, and then the really awful thing is that everybody knows you. So it's really different than having a visiting soloist. And also, I don't play as a soloist all the time. And I'm not playing a piece that I've done 25 times, and I was in Denver last week and, LA the week before playing the same Mendelssohn concerto. This is a brand new thing for everybody. And that's fun in a way. and it's also a challenge in a way. Same with Andreas. You know, I mean, he's never done this piece, as far as I know. I don't think he has. So hopefully he got the music by now.